everyone, and welcome to the conversation, CIWiL's Trajectory Across Generations. I am Cindy Andrews, and it is my honor to be your host for today. So, fun fact, I am very big on origin stories. I don't know if it's because I read a lot of Greek mythology or I did a lot of reading as a child, but I always want to know, how did something start? Where did we start? And I think as part of the younger generation, it's extremely important for us to understand and know, how did CIWiL begin? Because it helps us to appreciate the work that has happened over time, as well as to even be more focused in the values and missions to help us move forward. So Judith, can you shed some light? I would love to know, how did CIWiL originate?
So thank you so much. First of all, I really want to say for the record that being part of this intergenerational, 4-generation conversation this morning, for me, has many lessons. And I am mindful of the importance of such a conversation. Now, the story that, as I understand it, is that CIWiL was conceptualized in 1995, okay? And then there was a gap, because conceptualized doesn't mean that anything actually starts to happen. But in 1995, beg your pardon. But in 1998, there was a regional symposium entitled Gender Politics and Peace in Barbados, which then led to the formal establishment in 2005 at a meeting in Antigua. Now, the 1998 gathering, the regional symposium, was significant because it came 3 years after the Beijing conference, which was held in 1995 in Beijing. I didn't go, to tell it honest truth, me did afraid for fly so far to Beijing. But a huge delegation of Caribbean women were present at Beijing in 1995. The Caribbean women who participated in that conference returned home, and by 1998, they decided to follow up on behalf of Caribbean women on the agreements that had been made at the Beijing conference, right? So we don't have the time to go into the details of what the Beijing call for action actually highlighted, but it certainly highlighted the need for the Caribbean at that time to mobilize for urgent action around greater equality and opportunities for women and men and girls and boys, and pointed to the concrete ways to bring about the change. So we're going to see, in my understanding, there has always been a call for change at different points in CIWiL's history. And that is one of the ones that I think the call for change, urgent action expressed as change, that took place at Beijing and spurred our Caribbean sisters of that time on to doing that for the Caribbean with an initial symposium in Barbados in 1998. Does that help?
Definitely. And you can give us
details.
Learning so much. Like I knew that there was this large delegation of women that would have participated, but being able to piece it together and see the influence that their participation would have led to the development of CIWiL across the Caribbean, knowing we have different skills and backgrounds, and just seeing us being able to come together, I think it's going to be important if you share a bit more with us, just so that we can really put our framework up in understanding.
Okay. Briefly said, the aims and objective of the platform for action which came out of that conference was to advance the goals of equality, development, and peace for all women everywhere in the interest of all humanity. So already for me, in a different language, we are seeing references to what we today are calling intersectionalities, right? All women everywhere means women across race, class, social, across, to take into account all the vulnerabilities that all of these women face in each of their spaces. So that to me is really important. I also think that the vision of the Caribbean women that went to Beijing to take that call for action to Barbados and to make it publicly known to the region was an important step forward. Because that's where, and not just CIWiL, many other women's organizations in their own smaller way took the advantage, the opportunity to promote the Beijing call for action. But CIWiL did it regionally, which really sets it apart from all the other national initiatives that did take place after Beijing.
Definitely. And when we put it into scope from its inception, CIWiL has always been in support of gender issues, politics, and promoting and providing women with that support to engage within the leadership roles and do so well. And I think it's important for us to also make mention that even in its initial stages, coming out of that regional symposium in 2005 and the work that they did, one of the first things that they did was also the drafting of the Constitution at the strategic planning meeting in 2007. And we also we can recall some of the first interventions or activities undertaken by CIWiL under its action plan in 2008 to 2011. And would you be able to share some of those with us?
Well, the thing is, the way that CIWiL works, right? So it's a voluntary organization, right? And so that particular strategic plan, the first one, I was not physically a part of it. Because I had full-time work in Jamaica. And sometimes the CIWiL conversations in which we do work online take place when I'm just not available. But I think that strategic plan certainly provided the foundation on which the current strategic plan, which was approved 2 years ago, I think, by the current regional board, would have provided, that first strategic plan would have provided substantial information and guidance about the vision that the strategic plan would be working towards.
Definitely. And I appreciate how you're able to put it into context, because some persons think that there isn't a lot of flexibility when we engage in voluntary work because of how our work-life balance is. But being able to see that there's opportunity for you to volunteer, take a step back, and even come back into this space, all while still supporting the agenda is important. So Judith, how and at what point did you become involved in the network and organization?
Okay, so my particular CIWiL story begins with when CIWiL organized a 5-day workshop in transformational leadership and practice for women across the Caribbean. I was the head of a German foundation at the time, and one of our pillars was exactly that. The 5-day workshop was organized in collaboration with the IGDS Mona unit, led by Dr. Leith Dunn at the time. And Leith was already a partner with me at the FEST Foundation. So it was a natural fit. One of the contributions that FEST made was to work very hard and contribute to the participation of women from the non-English speaking Caribbean and for women from the OECS territories, because the way the Caribbean works, sometimes, Cindy, the smaller OECS territories often don't have the resources, particularly for women in leadership, to come to, this would have been in long ago, the resources to participate, right? So one of the things that FEST has always tried to do was to support those women, because invariably the women from Barbados and Jamaica and Trinidad, they're the larger islands, and funding partners often focus more on them, right? Now, in that workshop, the 5-day course was held at Mona Lodge, and it was facilitated by Rosina Wilshire. I'll never forget. That's when I first met Rosina, and I had the opportunity of just watch her work her magic. An important component of that 5-day training was a focus on mentorship. So the Jamaican sisters were invited to recommend mentors, persons who we knew would understand a mentorship role for women in leadership. Now, it's not just women in politics. CIWiL has always argued that we need to have transformational leadership, vision, and capacity and skills available for women in every single sector, not just in Parliament. Yes, so the participants in that workshop were teachers. They came from civil society organizations. There were some political representatives. There were women from rural Jamaica. So that from the beginning, that complement of women who were not only political leaders, as part of CIWiL's vision, was alive and well. I had the honor of being a mentor for a young woman who was a principal of a rural school in Jamaica, in Trelawney, which is very far, and we didn't have highway in those days. But certainly I made several trips to Trelawney and provided the mentorship support as we were asked to do. She had an interest in going into politics, but she needed to better understand what it would mean for her life, because it's a life choice and it has demands on our lives as women, or the care responsibilities. And she took her work as a principal very seriously, right? I think she did initially make one run at politics at the local level. And then my period of mentorship of her came to an end, right? But I really remember with gratitude, the capacity and the opportunity that I had to go to Trelawney and sit with her, sometimes in a staff meeting with other staff members, to help them other staff members understand why I was there and not a teacher. Why are you in the staff room? And so the conversation about transformational leadership took place in that space. And I'm really very grateful for that experience. And that's how I entered the CIWiL space and became one of the persons invited to sit on the regional board, because my contribution to CIWiL after that was more deliberate and there were more spaces for me to engage.
And when you spoke about Rosina, my face lit up, because she has been so instrumental in my journey within CIWiL and CIWiL space. And we will touch on that concept of transformational leadership a bit better. I just want to thank you for sharing, because I am currently living in Jamaica, so I understand the distance of trying to Trelawney. Even now with the highway, it's still a drive. So just seeing your commitment and your passion within this space and how you've been able to contribute from your first steps on your journey to now over 30 years of helping to inspire and shape women within this field. It is amazing. And I just want to say thank you so much, Judith, for the work that you've been able to do. So we've seen that over the years on a global stage, there has been a lot of call for the advancement for women's rights and gender equality. And we see even starting way back in 1975 with the International Decade of Women, and the adoption of CEDAW in 1979. And especially we see the significance of the Beijing conference, that in 1995, a lot of women, Caribbean women, were able to participate in that. There was the strong mandate to promote women's leadership in public spaces, especially due to the underrepresentation. Judith, based on all of these experiences and influences, how would you say that these landmarks have influenced gender consciousness and the gender agenda in Caribbean states, as well as CIWiL and our regional mandates?
Well, the truth is, the work never stops.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world evolves and we are a part of the larger world. How is it has affected? Well, there are varying opinions on this about how much has our work, or the work through the generations, actually achieved, right? Which is something I think a question we need to put to ourselves often, regularly, and seek honest answers. But I do remember that certainly in the Jamaican case, and when I was working as the director of FES in other Caribbean islands, the business of gender discrimination and the way women were discriminated against just because they were women, and which often led to violence, which often affected their ability to achieve, to get appointments in certain places. Those situations still exist, but in some of our countries, some progress has been made. And I feel that I always feel I need to give thanks to the persons on whose shoulders I stand, because it didn't begin with me. I'm quite clear about that. And so now, as we are looking forward, while we take cognizance of where we're coming from and what achievements we have made, we have to also acknowledge how different the environment, the global environment, the regional environment is now, and that there may be some new challenges that present themselves on our road to ensuring, for example, that young girls grow up in a space where they know that they have rights to be who they want to be, to make the decisions they want to make about their body, whether or not they have the right to stand up and say, but no, I understand, and this is my right to decide. I'm grateful that there is more of that kind of conversation happening now. That wasn't as prevalent as when we started, right? And so I welcome that, and I certainly give it that direction and that focus now. I give it my full support to help younger women in the current generations make their way through the current national, regional, and global environment.
And Judith, that was an excellent point, and I would love to hear Nadeen's take on it. Nadeen, how has our understanding of gender consciousness and the gender agenda in the Caribbean transformed over time?
Cindy, thanks for Mr. CIWiL for inviting me, and how has it changed over time? I think if I were to, cast my mind back as somebody who, studied some of the, what I would say, some of the practices, some of the scholarship, some of the thoughts about gender and women and children and other underserved groups that have emerged in Caribbean society, particularly through the work of women like Judith. If I were to, I would say, okay, we started at a point, I think, where there was this definite thrust towards advancing women's rights, and a recognition that just before the interventions highlighted by Judith, the Beijing conference, the work of the UN more generally, that I think there was a decided emphasis on women's rights and on this idea that women needed to be more appropriately represented in decision-making spaces for one, but that the plight of the Caribbean woman in respect of some very critical issues needed to be put on the agenda. And we're talking about looking at women's rights through domestic violence issues, women's human rights in its full capacity. And so from my assessment in looking back at how the issues related to women's rights have evolved, I can see an era where the focus was on women's rights. And usually when we talk about women's rights, we're talking about underserved populations, children, the disabled, and so on. So how that advocacy for women's rights, but those other issues such as children's rights on the agenda. So I would say that in the 60s and 70s, and I think it was perhaps about the 70s, Judith, that we saw establishing government, the women's bureaus, and this emphasis on bringing women's issues into the mainstream and talking about women, removing the kind of this idea of a, now we call it a gender blind approach, but at the time it was the idea that women need to be visibilized. And I might not necessarily be uncritical in my assessment, because one of the things I find troubling is that after a while there was this focus on gender. And the focus on gender did a lot to kind of take away from the need to continue the focus on women. So I think that in the international arena, there's a lot to be said about the space that the UN, the World Health Organization, the ILO created for women in the Caribbean to find voice in the organization of international organizations such as the UN system. I think that did a lot for women across the Caribbean and for women to emerge as people who could advocate for themselves, but also advocate for other groups that needed representation, right? But then there was this, along with the UN system, came a switch to gender. And this idea that there needed to be a broader focus than women's issues. I don't necessarily believe that the switch to gender brought about the positive kind of movements that we were seeing when there was this focus on women's rights. Because, you know, as somebody who works within the academy, one of the things that I have noticed is how that has begun to obliterate the focus on women's rights and to take away from the work that still needs to be done to ensure that the forward movement that we had been seeing in the 70s, that we would still continue to see that. So I sit in this office and in this space called Mary C. Cole Hall, where Lucille Mathurin-Mayer, who was one of the founding mothers of this movement or of this push, towards bringing women's realities and women's issues to the forefront of national and regional issues. But one of the things I noticed even in the completion of my PhD was that, there was a lot of resistance. The women who you hear about, they didn't do this. It wasn't easy for them to have these conversations. They were met with a lot of resistance from the establishment. And at UWI, they were met with a lot of resistance, even to the idea of teaching a course on women's rights. It had to be negotiated for years and years and years to offer a degree, even when the rest of the world was moving towards establishing women's studies or women's degrees in women's studies or offering courses. At UWI, it was resisted, and the women never found a comfortable home in the university. They were appendaged to different departments, and they had to do a lot of the work as volunteer work. They weren't paid. So this push to expand thinking about women's situation in the Caribbean, we don't always talk about the part that says that our institutions have resisted and made life difficult for those women who pushed. And I think part of that reality led to women, the way I see it, ceding to this term called gender, which has been problematic since its use for that continued push to ensure that women are experiencing continued improvement in their social and economic situation. Because what has happened now is that in places like the university, in places like government, in other institutions that represent the status quo, what we hear is that it's not just women we should be talking about, even if the situation warrants a conversation on women alone. And sometimes it does. What we have is people talking about using gender. What I have called it, people have weaponized the gender, weaponized the concept of gender equality, and now use it against women. So if I go to a place and I say, you know, I found it, I'm glad I'm a girl. If I say I'm glad I'm a girl, people in Jamaica will tell me, so what about I'm glad I'm a boy? And while that is a relevant conversation, the two do not have to exist in opposition of each other. Meaning, we shouldn't, every time we mention a situation where women need to be represented, it doesn't mean that we have to say men too, because what it does is it shuts down the conversation. It's not a way to open up the conversation and then say, let us explore what this means, and then, you know, see if we can offer solutions for the reality that women face. It means that what we use the intervention of men to do is to shut up the claims about women. And, you know, so for me, this introduction of this term called gender has really done damage to the work of the women's rights agenda. That's one. The other thing that it has done too is it has, in essence, silenced women who in many ways were very outright advocates for women's rights and the need for women's representation. Because you then have to start thinking about this idea of partnering with men. And while that is a novel idea, you have men, and we are not the ones who bring that to the table. Men have to want to partner. And the partnership shouldn't be focused on, okay, you have to liberate me too. The partnership should be, as a person of privilege, how do I take responsibility for the reality that women face? You know, that's how, to me, for men to be in partnership with women towards gender equality, that's where they come first. And I am very well aware that in the Caribbean, matters of race, matters of class interrupt the conversation. And so the reality of Black men, for example, necessitates a kind of intervention, which might sometimes be very similar to the intervention that is needed for women. I'm well aware of that. But overwhelmingly, we should understand the framework called patriarchy. And I think the reality that has emerged in the Caribbean has not led to a substantially sustained critique of patriarchy, so that generations later on understand what their intervention in that critique should sound like. So one of the conversations that we have around the international organizations, like the International Labor Organization, is in Jamaica, for example, is that in Jamaica you have more women managers. And then that shuts down the conversation because it tells us that women are okay. But we don't then do the critical engagement around, okay, so what does that really mean? You know, are you here? There are more women than men at UWI. It shuts down the conversation. It doesn't open up the conversation, which then speaks to something that is mentioned in CIWiL about the rights to education, the rights in education, and the rights through education. So One other issue, those two are linked, right? The labor issue and the women's access. There was a report that was released the other day. I think it was from the Canadians that looked at the fact that even though women are graduating from the university, registering in the university at a higher rate, the outcomes of schooling, right? The kinds of jobs, those management positions that they're getting, doesn't do enough to move them out of a position of vulnerability, doesn't do enough to push them into decision-making and leadership, doesn't do enough to push them into land ownership or business ownership. So those things that would cause women then to truly challenge the male-dominated status quo of power, education is not doing that for women. So we are not having that conversation. We are just shut down at the level of there are more women than men at UWI, so men are marginalized. There are more women in law, so men are marginalized out of law. There are more women managers in Jamaica, so men have been marginalized. And then the conversation stops there. And so, yes.
You've a lot to unpack, and I see Judith and Charlene, they want to enter the conversation. Judith,
I think it's fair that Charlene should have her say no. I have a question, but it can wait till after Charlene. Okay. I want to support something Nadeen said and expand on it, but I think we need to hear from Charlene.
I really just love how Nadeen has unpacked what I believe is the real major challenge to advancing women's rights. I think you've hit the nail on the head that whole, the gender agenda has basically hijacked the women's agenda and creates another layer that we have to move through. But I just wanted to support that, and I'm very pleased that I think you've laid it out so well, because the minute we start talking about and advancing women rights, these are the things we face. But I'll let you finish and circle back. But excellent.
Wanted to say to thank Nadeen. Well, Nadeen and I talk all the time. We go far back, and I always have to congratulate her. And I'm doing it again in public, Nadeen, for hanging in there. And you were determined to get your PhD on your terms, so that you could share with us what you did today, right? So thank you again. What I wanted to say, though, that in the space that I work, I get criticized sometimes because I use the word gender differently. It depends the space I'm in. So sometimes I'll say to my colleagues, I don't introduce the word gender at the beginning at all. I start with some data. I start with rights generally, not to start with rights. And I would ask a provocative question like, do women have the right to have rights? Does somebody have to give them permission to have rights? And the answer is no. We don't need permission to exercise, or we shouldn't, to exercise our rights. And so to sort of strategically push back against the processes which have evolved that often shut down the conversations about women's rights, I've found that if I ask a question like, in each of the spaces in which you, if I'm talking to a younger person, in each of the spaces in which you operate, a workspace, a home space, are you experiencing equality with whomever else is in that space? How are decisions made? Who makes the decisions? In that space, do you observe that the men have the more rights and authority to make the decisions, whether it's in the home, in an office, wherever? And finally, do we as women value men's roles more than women's roles? Is that how we're socialized? So when we start valuing their roles more than ours, then we begin trampling on the rights of women as well. So I thank Nadeen for unpacking it the way she did. And I am challenged sometimes to do the work, the women's rights work, and acknowledging that this conversation about gender is here, and we have to deal with it and challenge it so that we can put the women's rights agenda back at the center of that agenda. That's what I wanted to say. So
thank you. Thank you, Judith. And what we've been able to see from Nadeen's contribution is that the way the women's rights movement has progressed over time has not been linear. And it has not been this easy road for us. I'm just making sure I didn't stick. This easy road for us, because there have been blocks, there have been points where we have been able to gain significant advancement within the movement, but there have been periods that have been slowed and rippled and laden with challenges that we have yet to still overcome. And in trying to overcome them, there's been a space where we needed to reconceptualize and redefine what exactly would be more socially acceptable for us to continue this discussion. So Nadeen, thank you so much for bringing it into this space. And as we go deeper in, I really think that we would love to hear how and when were you first introduced to CIWiL? We'd love to hear that story.
I was introduced to CIWiL, I think, late. As a matter of fact, my introduction to CIWiL was first sending one of my students to the CIWiL training in St. Lucia. So, and that time it was just this, part of what I learned, what I did at UWI, I do at UWI. Let me start from, I came here to UWI as a student. And I like Judith, I like to look at the numbers, right? So I walked into the student leadership office on campus, and they have the names of the guild presidents over time on the table, on the wall. And I noticed that it was pure men. I was a little bit taken aback by it. I was like, so that don't make no sense, because I've been hearing since I walk on campus that men are marginalized. There are so many women at UWI. And then I walk into the student leadership office and I noticed that there were perhaps about 4 women over a 50-odd year period who served in student leadership. So as a student, I thought it was problematic and I ran. I didn't win because I also didn't understand the complexity of that. That's why it's so important to prepare women for this reality. Because when a woman enters by herself, she thinks the issues she will face are personal to her. If she is not located in the wider scope and understanding of patriarchy and how patriarchy attempts to treat women who have leadership ambitions, she's going to be damaged if she engages an institution or a space and isn't properly equipped. And I think I was scarred from that experience because I never understood the wider context of women seeking to access power. So when I came to work at Mary C. Cole Hall, I still had that question as a staff member, but I recognized that I had a responsibility to help women to understand why they weren't running for the leadership of student government. I had a responsibility to help to prepare them to run and to be successful at it, to not feel as if they were a third wheel, and to not feel as if they were not competent to run an election or to win an election, So part of that exercise was, of course, exposing the women to leadership. So if I saw something that looks like leadership, I was going to tell the young women that I lead, apply, or I would reach out to organizations and entities and ask them, how can I get students involved? And so on. And so through that, we applied for one of the students from I'm Glad I'm a Girl and the Mary C. Cole Hall to participate in the St. Lucia training. And she came back and she was very, very much impressed and transformed by the experience. And then when they came to Jamaica at the Mona Visitors Lodge, someone reached out to me and asked me if I had any student who wanted to participate. At that time, I couldn't. That's because I don't know why people were not I think some people applied, and then somebody one of the organizers, I can't remember her name right now, who coordinated the Jamaica training. She said to me, "Why don't you apply?" And I was like, "Me? Why would I apply? I'm looking for my students to apply and be involved." And she said, "No, man, you apply. You could apply." I think it was in this summer, so perhaps this time students were not on campus. Right, students were not on campus, and it was late summer. And so it was hard for me to find students to participate. So she convinced me to apply, and I was like, this is not for me. But I applied still, and of course, I participated in I think it was a 1 week set of training.
Sorry, can you remember what year that was?
Oh no, Judith. I'll find out. I'll find out and tell you. It was Rosina participated. You presented. You know who presented that year, Judith? She was the first woman minister of justice. Remember this whole thing with Tudus when it came down, and
oh yes, she was, or the Attorney General.
The AG, right?
She wouldn't sign the paper for his
extradition.
All of that. Okay.
Yeah,
yes, I don't remember her name.
She presented that year, right?
Can you remember an evening session we had the one I went to, where the business of the mentorship was put firmly on the agenda as part of the evening session? We had asked for mentors from both political parties. One didn't answer at all.
Right.
The other one recommended Aluna Samba.
Right. And Maxine Henry Wilson was my mentor.
So that might have been a later activity.
I mean, Aluna Samba presented at that conference, at that training, but she spoke more to her I remember her saying decidedly in that one, when you're in politics as a woman, you need a wife. I remember that. But that was important for me, because prior to then, even though I was operating within a feminist framework in terms of understanding women and leadership, I never really had enough information about the Caribbean Jamaican reality. Mm-hmm. And that time was when we got ROC's transformational leadership information. Mm-hmm. And so I had a wider perspective to draw from across the Caribbean, and resources as well. Because that was when I was introduced to people like Judith and Rosina and Lynette and all the women who were involved in the work in Jamaica. I hadn't before had a community to work within. I was doing the work by myself at CIWiL and at UWI. So that training really, for me, what I came out of it as was a woman now who had a community of other women to work with. Because prior to that, I wasn't aware that there was this, community of women's rights activists that were there that I could tap into, that I could connect with.
And Nadeen, that's so important that you highlighted. CIWiL has been able to create so many communities across the region. And for me, I also had a similar experience, because I started my journey with CIWiL 3 years ago when they launched their Young Women in Leadership program in Trinidad and Tobago. And I was a part of the first all-women parliamentary sitting at our parliament in Trinidad. And from that experience and being equipped and being able to be trained in the necessary skills and tools of transformational leadership and gender responsive budgeting and intersectionality, and being able to understand and connect with other women within that space has been so instrumental and crucial to why I'm even sitting here and the work that I'm able to do in various communities. So I think it's so important that CIWiL has continued over all of these years to be able to provide that community and home for young women and women across age group differences, classes, to be able to come together and find that space for themselves to share, to learn, but also to continue the work. And I really want to bring in Charlene, because CIWiL now has 9 national chapters across the region, with the latest being Jamaica, formed only this year. However, the Bahamas chapter was one of the first to be formed in 2019. So Charlene, please tell us, how and why did you get involved with the CIWiL Bahamas National Chapter?
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Judith and Nadeen, for a very interesting and engaging conversation. Love the background information, and I'm like you, Cindy, I love to know the origin of things myself. So for me, my journey with CIWiL, well, I would say first and foremost that from a young age, I've always wanted, I had a desire to serve, to help persons and individuals to become better. So my journey really of leadership began in the church. I would have served from a children's church worker, Sunday school teacher, women's leader, and then my husband became a pastor and then leader of our denomination, and then leader of the Bahamas Christian Council. So my journey for leadership and helping persons would have come in that perspective and light. And it was when my husband served as president for Bahamas Christian Council, and we would get invited to basically everything national. And listening to the conversations, listening to, the background, getting to really hear the context of how some decisions were being made, why we're doing what we're doing, why the nation is going in a certain direction, I began to realize that, you know what? Things are the way they are because of decisions, not because, that's just how it is and we can't help ourselves, but really because someone made a decision. And I got to thinking, what if we could influence the decision? What if we could have people making decisions for the right reason, with the right motive, for the greater good? And it was during that a sort of epiphany and understanding that I myself came to the conclusion and offered, when asked, to be a part of possibly changing the landscape and the decisions that were being made. I answered the call. I would have joined a political party for the express reason of really how we can get our nation on track to realizing the Bahamian dream that it was founded in the early days of our independence. And we celebrate 50 years today, this year actually, 50 years of independence. And there are some things that were put forward, promoted, that we haven't seen yet. And so it was, how do we get to realize some of those, the Bahamian dream? And once I got involved in the political front line, up to that point, in 2012, up to that point, I had never even attended a political rally. So for me to jump on the front line was a major step and undertaking. And after that, but that shifted my my trajectory and opened my understanding in a way and exposed me in a way that I believe changed my life substantially and for good. Because from then on, it was really about national interest, not just, my smaller community and not just my church. I would have heard about the meetings that CIWiL came to the Bahamas, met with the Department of Gender and Family Affairs with the view of establishing a local chapter. And that was sometime in 2018, leading into 2019. I missed the first meeting that they came and held, but I heard about it, and girlfriend reached out and said, listen, I'm sure you would want to know about this and be a part of this. And so I was at the second meeting where they discussed how the steps to be taken to form a national chapter. When they talked about what CIWiL was all about, the role of CIWiL, the bipartisan nature of CIWiL in particular, and then they talked about the nominations for the regional board to get the chapter, well, not the regional board, the executive board, to get the chapter going, and the opportunity that would exist to partner and connect with other CIWiL organizations around the Caribbean. I was definitely very interested. Initially, I thought to myself, well, I definitely wanted to be on the board so that I could have a voice in the direction of the chapter. Initially, I thought I would vie for the treasurer position because, well, as an accountant, I figured I have the competence to do that. But as I was preparing to put forward my interest in the treasurer position, the thought came very strongly to mind. What about the chair? Initially, I didn't think I was ready to be chair of an organization connected to the Caribbean. In that way, I hadn't previously been a part of any Caribbean organizations. And so I felt that, okay, maybe I don't know enough for this. And I would have discussed it with several of my trusted network. And they were like, absolutely, go for it. And so I did. And like they say, the rest is history somewhat. And I'm very glad I did. CIWiL has had a very tremendous impact on my life. I am glad I went for the chair position for several reasons. One of the reasons that made the chair position also attractive to me was that the chair would get the opportunity to be represented on the regional board. And I was also interested in having a voice at the regional level. And so that was an attraction. And the role as chapter chair, what I have found over, and this is now my second term, so I'm going into my fourth year now as chapter chair. And what I found is that chapter chair is a critical position. I believe as chapter chair, you're the face of the organization. And I wanted to ensure that as such, I represented strong, competent, transformational leadership with advocacy. I saw my role as being to keep the board and the chapter focused on the overall mission of CIWiL in developing our work plan to fulfill the primary objectives. I loved and embraced the objectives of CIWiL, the outputs as they were, defined. I thought they were an excellent way to help us actually achieve these goals. I'd been a part of a number of other organizations that, have lofty goals, but I hadn't really been a part of, in a social setting, seeing those goals really broken down into a defined work plan with a defined methodology of achieving those goals. And I loved it. And I thought, you know, as an accountant, as a banking executive, I've seen these things work in the professional and secular arena. And so being able to bring them into my social arena and to fulfill social goals was very exciting for me. So when we looked at outreach to girls and young women, strengthening their leadership, and also connecting with other women's organizations, training to providing training and support for electoral candidacies for women, supporting effective communications and advocacy. These were things that they just inspired me and got me, you know, that if we could do these things effectively, I truly believed then and do now that we could move the needle in our nation. And so those were the reasons that got me involved in CIWiL and the roles and responsibilities that I see that I should play as the chapter chair.
Now, Charlene, I really connect with what she's saying, because having been on the national chapter executive coming straight out of participating in the CIWiL program and seeing so many of the young women who would have participated in that program choose to come together, it really spoke to what Nadeen mentioned in having that sense of community and that sisterliness conviction. And as you said, being able to connect and find a space where the goals, the mission, the values was something that you were able to align with. And being a part of CIWiL really changes your perspective. It really has been able to equip us and help us to grow personally and professionally within this space. Now, throughout this conversation, we would have been discussing transformational leadership. It is a strategic pillar of CIWiL. In fact, the organization's vision is to enable Caribbean women to realize gender equality and equity for sustainable transformational leadership and people-centered development. Judith, please tell us, what exactly is transformational leadership and how did it come about?
Well, having reminded myself that in the very early days of CIWiL, it involved women who had come together, having had their own experiences in challenging discrimination against women, violence against women, in many ways that our societies, those things take place in our society. And so I think the understanding was we have to transform the way not just society and its institution run, but we have to also transform the relationships between women and men. We have to transform the relationships between women and men across classes and race and address and disabilities and sexual identities. So to do that, you will have to understand each of those, which means some research and using data to guide you to who is most affected, what strategies are they using for their survival, right, in a space. So it requires a different kind of engagement in which you're actually open to examining your own self to begin with.
Yes, and I was waiting for you to get to that point. I felt like it was important for us to acknowledge that transformational leadership first starts with how you see yourself.
One of us, correct. Mm-hmm.
And that's so important because sometimes, as Nadeen even highlighted, we don't see ourselves as leaders. We don't see ourselves as feminists. We don't just see ourselves doing our work. We see ourselves contributing. We see ourselves volunteering within this space. And when we're able to actually hone in on what we're doing and make it more focused and make it more targeted and see how what we're doing plays into the different aspects of society and development, it becomes more meaningful. It becomes more purposeful, Judith. And I think that was so important in the way that you brought it home, because we've been doing this and this has been going on for so many years. We were doing it without knowing that we were doing it. And now we have the opportunity to put a name to what we're doing and our experiences. That way, we're able to now share this information across generations. The storytelling process and the preservation of what we're doing now becomes more impactful because we're able to make those linkages and those connections over time. So, Judith, I have a...
I just add quickly that doing it though, we need to remind ourselves that we really need to understand the context.
Yes.
And that we learn a lot by talking to each other across generations. Yeah. But there's also a need to inform ourselves about a research at a deeper level, right? So, and the analysis that research generates, so that we are in a better place, not just to operate on behalf of each other in a narrow space, are better able to engage women across class, race, and gender and sexuality. We're able to better engage women in rural Jamaica, which is you require a different kind of understanding, as Nadeen will tell you. And we're all from islands. I don't know if the Bahamas have any rural Bahamas, but yeah, I know you have plenty beach, but
we have family islands that are very rural as well.
Yeah, but you get the point I'm making though. So it's not one size fits all. It cannot be. And we have to take it very seriously for ourselves as transformational leaders to do the work, to better understand, where do we start? Do we understand that we need to start where people are in their lives and not make assumptions about what they should or should not be doing, but to understand what it is the women in a family with no social support, no financial support, what is her daily life like? Does she understand where the challenges are coming from? And don't blame herself, it's because I'm not good enough, or because, so the transformational leadership for me is a huge responsibility that we take on if we really want to see the change that we know is necessary.
Definitely. And I really appreciate how you brought it back home by reminding us that it's important for us to take into consideration the context and the unique experiences that women may have, even though we have shared issues, because our experiences may differ because of all of these other factors that we must take into consideration. Now, Nadeen, you have a rich background in leadership and politics. How do you see transformational leadership and this approach fitting in among women in politics and leadership?
So I'll start with one thing first, and that is sisterhood. That's one of the, in doing my research and in my own work at Mary C. Cool Hall, I have learned that sisterhood, and by sisterhood, I mean a community of women who support and who stand behind each other and who provide the kinds of expertise and the kinds of resources that women need to propel themselves forward. That sisterhood is critical to this idea of transformational leadership. It's something that I say to, the women I engage in at UWI all the time, I engage with at UWI. Because again, let's go back. One of the points I made in the first intervention was that when women know they have shoulders to stand on, when they know they have a community that will support them, the work that they have to do in leadership becomes easier. Representing women's interest in political leadership, representing the interest of the underserved and the vulnerable becomes easier, because you know that your community is strong and is rooting for you. It's not easy as a woman to sit in a space of a certain kind of power when you represent another kind of power. You know, it's not easy to sit in that space and hold your ground and to speak the truth that you came to speak, even when the power dynamics have shifted and you now become a minority. That concept of you being in a room and being the only one or just one of three is not, when you're outnumbered, you know you're outnumbered, right? So I think one of the things I have learned about transformational leadership for women is that it needs a community. Women need to support women so that women can go to do the work that they had intended to do. The other thing is that it needs women who go to lead to be educated about what their agenda should be. I have found that there are a lot of women who enter politics, or of the few that enter, most of them do not know what an agenda of transformation would look like. So pretty soon they do and say the same things that the status quo would say. And their leadership intervention doesn't really lead to any shifting of the ground of signs, as feminists would say. Nothing changes as a result of their leadership intervention. And a whole lot is put on the shoulders of women when they decide to take on leadership. They are expected to not operate in the same way that others operate. And for that to happen, they have to know what it is they're expected to do differently. It's not a personal thing. It's not how you dress or the dress or the shoes you wear or how long you pray or how you turn or whether or not you're in the room. It's your leadership agenda. It's the things that you want change. It's also how you engage the people around you. So if you buy into the idea that leadership is power and that this is how power looks, I must talk tough and I must talk strong and I must do I must demonstrate leadership in the same way that I have seen, then you might find your transformational agenda becoming compromised. And what is on your agenda, i.e., what are the things you want to see? What if we're talking about the budget and the economy, what is your intervention? Are you just mimicking what you've heard through the years? Or do you have something new, substantially new to bring to the agenda? If we're talking about community development and you being a member of parliament or a senator, what is on your agenda? What are the things that you bring to parliament? What are the conversations you have in cabinet? What are the ways in which you intervene in the discussions in the Senate? What is on your agenda? And so for me, transformational leadership is a community that supports your agenda. It's understanding that leadership is also leadership is visual. Leadership is how you present and how you posture, especially in the Caribbean where we like charismatic leadership. And where over time people have found leadership to be deceitful, hypocritical, and they no longer trust leadership. There's a way in which if you are a woman and you want to enter leadership and be transformational, and it would apply to men too, you have to let your walk and your talk match. There's more pressure on you to do that because immediately people judge you. People say, you're going and you're just like the men. And then they lose faith in the capacity of your leadership to do the thing that you had said you wanted to do, right? One of the things I remember, one of my markers asking about UE students who ran for the position of guild president in those women I had interviewed, she asked me, did their agenda change? Was it change? Did their leadership present change, or did it just present exchange? You understand? Some women go into power and their leadership doesn't present change. It's just exchange, no matter whether it's a man or a woman occupying the seat or the city or the position of power. it don't matter. It's just exchange. It's just exchanging one leader for another. If it's change now, then you have that agenda of transformation, and you have your community that is the target of your leadership, and you know what needs to be done, and you go about with the decided agenda to get that done. And so for me, that is transformational leadership. It's understanding that you need your community. You know who your community is. You know that sisterhood is important to you. You know that you can't just turn up and lead like everybody else. You can't lead in the way the status quo leads. And you know that you have to represent change. You can't just be exchange. You have to represent change. And so your agenda of leadership, your transformation and agenda must represent the work that you need to do to get the things done that need to be done, you know?
Yeah, I know, and I really appreciate how you were able to put it in context, not just from a political standpoint, but even as leaders, we often get caught in this whirlpool, get into these spaces, and sometimes because of the demands or even the social environment and the pressure and the standards, the unwritten rules that are expected of us, often cause shift. But one of the key things that you spoke about was the importance of sisterhood and sisterliness. So Charlene, I'm going to bring you in now, because a core value of CIWiL is sisterliness. But as women, we will have our differences, and especially across generations and ages, there will be some differences and maybe some gaps where we may have to work on intentionally. So how can we work better together across age and gender differences?
So one of the things actually what we found when we did a training for women in political leadership or interested in political leadership, we found that that whole issue of sisterliness, and Nadeen would have detailed that out, we found that was an issue. But here is the thing. What we also found was that when women are made aware that unsisterliness, actually, it's not okay. It is not okay for you to put down a sister just because she is a sister, or for you not to support a sister. Then we found that just raising that awareness helped to counteract that behavior, that negative behavior. And also what it did was it encouraged women to support, celebrate the achievements, accomplishments of others. And so in our groups, what we find is that there is a lot more of the celebration taking place. When a woman accomplishes or does something in leadership, does something in the community, you find a whole lot more awareness being raised. CIWiL in particular also did a first Bahamian women list. And we found that we came up with, over 100 first Bahamian women doing significant things. And then there was just an outpouring of others coming forward with acknowledgement of things that the first woman did. All of these ways, I think, when we raise that awareness, helps to improve the overall willingness to speak up, overall willingness to stand together. And to the point about women having an agenda and knowing that they have that sisterly community that would support them. Again, what we're finding by our Women in Parliament initiative, by our training initiatives, by our caucusing initiatives, we're finding that it's giving the women on the front line more boldness to stand up for issues because they know they have that support in the background. It's giving them more boldness to be unique and to come up with original initiatives and not just exchanging, but really being true to themselves, what it is that they are passionate about and what it is that they value. So, women oftentimes feel like, especially if it's something seen as emotional or, soft issues, that they may not want to, women in leadership may not want to take on those issues because they don't want to come across as being soft. But when we teach and train on transformational leadership and see that, you know what, we can embrace our uniqueness, our emotions, and the qualities that make us who we are, then we don't have to downplay those issues that we are passionate about, even if they come across as being soft. So those are ways that I see, Cindy, how sisterliness could be strengthened and encouraged.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Now, ladies, we've been having such a rich and engaging conversation. Judith, as we wrap, I would really like to know, what do you think is the value and importance of intergenerational dialogue and knowledge exchange to Caribbean feminism and to the institutional strengthening and continuity of CIWiL?
So I am going to, in very summary form,
yes,
use a quotation from my very dear friend, Andai, feminist and a fierce advocate for women's human rights. She says the point is to change the world.
Mm-hmm.
To change the world, beginning with our world, the world in which your sister down the road lives, the world in which the female parliamentarians live, the world in which our female children live, to change the world. And I'm mindful of the importance of that, because in order to change the world, we have to better understand and learn from the experiences of each other across the generations. Because a lot of what we're speaking about didn't start today. And it is maybe the same thing that happened 30 years ago. It's manifesting differently today. So the intergenerational dialogue allows us to share the understanding of those things, the learnings, the challenges, and the opportunities that we created to help change our world. That, to me, that is the most important thing. Knowledge exchange, because the truth is, Cindy, the challenges that you face in this crazy global world in which we're living, complete with social media and all that that means, the world in which the patriarchy is alive and well, it just manifests itself differently. It has many faces. It will allow a female leader to emerge in a generation. And then they say, okay, that's it. Continue the struggle, right? So the intergenerational dialogue provides us a space where, as sisters, I love that word, we can share those experiences and the learnings and the research in a way that is respectful and supportive of each other. We don't have to agree to everything, but certainly be supportive. Once we understand the situations and the challenges we are each facing, the sisterliness within us will say, oh, now I understand what you're going through. This is how I think we together could overcome it. That's, for me, what sister transformational leadership about, and the role of that in the intergenerational dialogue.
Thank you so much, Judith. And I think it's so important that when we have these conversations of exchanges, the experiences of gatekeeping that some women may engage in when they emerge within certain spaces, we're able to break that barrier, because then we're able to go back and hear the stories of how none of this could be possible where we are right now if women decided that other women could not get an opportunity to build. within the work or enter the space that they are already in, because of how patriarchy often puts us against each other, and how socially and culturally we're often encouraged to see each other as competitors and not as sisters who, in our own rights and way, are able to help each other on our various journeys without taking away any shine from what we can do and achieve individually. Thank you so much, Nadeen. As we wrap, you've spoken so much about the importance of sisterhood and having this community, and an important part in that process is mentorship. And I think mentorship is so important for us in that way. But within the space that we are in, how does mentorship specifically build the leadership capacities of women from an early stage?
You know, there are several things that we talk about. You know, we stand tall because we stand on the backs of those who went before us, or each one must reach one, or you must reach down a hand. It's that recognition that if you are a part of a community of people, if you're a part of this society where human beings are engaged in this process of trying to create a more equal and just society, then you have a responsibility to ensure that you are not the only one doing good work. You know, for me, it's not so much about the individual woman as it is about, you know, there is this work that needs to be done, and we need women to do the work. We need people who we can enlist to do the work. Because I know a lot of mentorship, you know, young people nowadays, right, you know, when they're thinking about their career goals and they're going to be strategic, there are some people who you need to know. And so it becomes a very individual thing. But for me, that is not as enriching as thinking, I am here at Mary CIWiL Hall. When I leave, who continues the work? You know, how do I ensure that the work doesn't stop with me? How do I ensure that in the process of my being here, even if people were, you know, people were doing the work in other places, that they go and are able to find the same agenda somewhere else, and they now have the information and the tools to do that work somewhere else. So I think the mentorship is important, because for me, what the mentorship does is it teaches you a methodology. It gives you a background information. It gets you to see the work that a woman is doing. You know, this whole thing that people say you can't be what you can't see. So, you know, you get to experience up close and personal somebody doing the work. And hopeful, to me, it's also a check and balance, yeah? Because when I have young women who are looking on me, I then realize that, you know, there's a particular way you have to do this work, because some people are learning from you. You know, so it also provides a kind of a checking of you if your head gets too big, or if you become too caught up with yourself in the work, you are reminded that this work isn't really yours. You know, this legacy that you're building should be able to last a couple generations after you've gone. Who are the people who will take over? It's about you. Yes, you are important to it, but it's not only about you. It's also about the other women who need to know that this work is important. So that's what mentorship is for me. Mentorship is finding other soldiers in this struggle. It's finding other sisters who need community. It's finding other women who need to know the nature of the work, the substance of the work, and the methodology that is necessary to get the work done. People to pass information to. You know, that's what it is for me. And if we don't have mentorship, then it means that each struggle ends with a generation. So when I leave, then all the work that I would have done would have just died with me. I wouldn't have given my shoulders for another generation of women to stand on. You know, so in order for my legacy to live on, I need to give my shoulders for another group of women to stand on, so that and the thing about giving people my shoulders to stand on is that, I'm still standing on somebody's shoulders, but then we bring the work to a higher level. We take it from where it is, where I had it, to the next level. So it's all about advancing the agenda and getting the work done, propelling, yes, the individual to a higher level, but them recognizing that it's not only about my personal growth and development. It's also about the community. It's also about the society.
And Nadeen, thank you so much. You have been able to remind us in that contribution that where we are in this space and what we're doing is so much bigger than us. And when we think about that in relation to sisterhood, sisterliness, and mentorship, we're able to see that I am doing something, yes, but I can't be the only one doing this if this must continue and if we must make the progress that we want to see and the impact for the space and for other women. We must make them feel like they can be a part of it by not taking it up and holding it so close to us that we think that we are the only ones capable. And if it's not us, then it's gonna be nobody. So thank you. Thank you so much for reminding us about that. Charlene, you have been such a light in this conversation, adding to the engagement and the information that Judith and Nadeen have been able to do as they share their light with us. So as we wrap, what advice would you give to CIWiLers from previous generations, and as we continue to build and expand a new CIWiLers, about drawing insights from this conversation and even their thoughts about CIWiL across the region?
I would say to anyone interested in CIWiL as an organization, I think the information shared in terms of what CIWiL is all about and where CIWiL has come from helps to provide that foundation. But the key for me with CIWiL is the Caribbean impact, meaning we can garner from across the region. We can bring the voices, the experiences of our sisters in all the different spaces and places of the region. When we get asked questions here in the Bahamas, and I'm able to draw reference to what Jamaica faced and how they dealt with it, and just recently asked about gender-based violence and the cost of that to the community, I was able to draw from a presentation from the Jamaican group. And so when we're able to reach across and share the data, the statistics, the experiences from our Caribbean sisters, that is, to me, one of the greatest values and strengths being a part of an organization like CIWiL brings. And then the cross-section of persons, the bipartisan nature, and to ensure that we're hearing views from all sides. The ability to engage and connect and counter and interact with professional women, with women from different walks of life, different educational backgrounds. This is what makes the CIWiL experience rich, and being exposed to it is in what helps us, I think, to improve our understanding, be able to speak intelligently to why women have rights and are equal and deserve equity and should, that it is not something that it should be doled out to us. I said to somebody, we have a right because we're 50% of the planet. Long and short, end of story. And so being a part of an organization like CIWiL helps women to understand these things and to be able to stand firm and strong. And I would end there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies. We have been sitting, chatting, and the time has flown by. When I got the time check, I was like, there's absolutely no way that we've had such a rich and engaging discussion, and it feels like we just started. It has been an honor to engage in this conversation with you. We are 4 generations of women that have participated and contributed, not just as individuals, but in collective and shared spaces and communities, and being able to hear the stories of the origin of CIWiL back in the 90s, to the growth of the movement across the Caribbean space and the impact that it has been able to make in our communities, really reminds us that the work that we are doing is, 1, extremely important, but 2, it goes beyond just our individual contribution, and it must be built on by engaging and mentoring and ensuring that we preserve our story and history, and to engage in sustaining and continuing this experience of community and sisterhood and sisterliness that we have been able to participate in. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to take this time to thank our viewers for watching and invite our viewers to share their comments, ask questions within the section, and we will have more of these discussions as we continue to explore not only the trajectory across generations, but to highlight and discuss with so many amazing women their perspectives of our experiences as we continue this week. Thank you.